comes after the end of history. Back in 1989, when the Berlin Wall had fallen and the end of the Soviet Union was near, US political scientist Francis Fukuyama argued that the success of Western liberal democracy suggested that humanity had arrived at the close of a great ideological struggle. But nearly 30 years later, democracy is under assault across the globe with the rise of authoritarian, illiberal and nationalist governments. In his new book, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, Francis Fukuyama criticizes what he says is a traditional left-right spectrum of politics giving way to one defined by identity. Francis Fukuyama, thanks for joining me on Upfront. In your new book, Identity, you argue that so-called identity politics is one of the chief threats to liberal democracies today. How do you define identity politics, and how is what you're saying any different to what conservatives have been complaining about for years?
Well, identity is based on this feeling that I have this inner self that's not being adequately recognized, and what I want more than resources or stuff is actually recognition and respect. And that's what drives groups to enter into politics, because they feel as members of groups, particularly if they've been marginalized, that they're not getting respect, and they want that from the political system. And liberal democracy is based on individuals, not on group memberships, and not on, these.
Yeah, there's some very thoughtful parts of the book, and then there's bits where you make some sweeping statements. You say Black Lives Matter is fighting for equality and basic rights. ISIL, extremist group, terrorist group, whatever you want to call it, has a very genocidal approach to the rest of the world, isn't fighting for equality and justice, clearly. But then you seem to lump them together in this critique of identity politics. You literally put them together on the same page.
Yeah. Well, morally, obviously, they're not equivalent at all. I think what's the same is actually the psychology, because if you look at the psychology of many people that sign up for ISIS, they believe that Muslims around the world are being disrespected, killed, disregarded, and that they need agency, and that their membership in this group is what's going to give them both community, fellowship with other Muslims. They're going to be able to support that group. Now, of course, the way they do it is terrible. Yeah. And it's,
But to say that ISIL and Black Lives Matter are different manifestations of the same phenomenon is a little bit too far, isn't it?
They're manifestations of a similar psychological phenomenon. The only way I'm saying that these groups are comparable is in that psychological phenomenon whereby, that demand for dignity is very deeply rooted in all of us. It may be more justified in some cases than in others, but there is a common, framework in which this happens.
One of the other important arguments that you raise in the book is about class. You talk about the importance of challenging inequality. Many would say that there's an intersectional politics. They talk about race and class. You can't treat these things on their own, and sometimes solving one problem doesn't solve the other. For example, if we say actually we should focus on class, not identity issues, race issues, how do you deal with a recent study which found that black boys raised in the US, even in the wealthiest families, living in the nicest neighborhoods, are still less likely to earn in adulthood what white boys with similar backgrounds might earn? They're more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy. Now, in that scenario, dealing with class and income is not enough. You have to deal with the racism and the discrimination that they're enduring.
Yeah, no, so everybody is subject to that kind of discrimination, but I think there's also a ton of empirical data out there that actually shows that class defined by your level of education, basically whether you've got a higher education or just a high school education or less, is really the single thing that's the most determinative of your life opportunities and outcomes.
You say that, and yet, as I say,
and it cuts across
it doesn't always cut across. You say that the study I'm citing from the Equality of Opportunity Project, a group of researchers at your college, Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau, they found that black men raised in the top 1% by millionaires were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning $36,000 a year. You can't say that class is some kind of leveler.
I mean, there's plenty of data showing that education is really what's important in determining outcomes. Now, access to education is one of the big disadvantages that black people in the United States have, and so that's, that is something that is determined by race. But I do think that, if you look at the overall phenomenon of inequality in the United States, a lot of that is in the white population, because the white population has gone in these two opposite directions as well. Well-educated white people have done extremely well. Poorly educated white people have fallen off a social cliff in many respects.
So I want to push back on your education point, because it does feel a little bit utopian. If you take France, which you also talk about in the book, you say, for example, if the French liberalize their labor laws, that will help minority communities who feel marginalized, left out of the economy, and yet all of the surveys show that, for example, in France, if your name is Mohammed, you're 4 times less likely to be invited back for a job interview, even with the same CV, same resume, as your Christian, white, Catholic counterpart. Education doesn't solve that problem. That's a race issue. That requires, quote-unquote, identity politics.
Yeah. I say that, you know, all of these specific forms of discrimination are bad. There's a perfectly good reason for pushing back against these specific forms of discrimination. But I also think that you need to balance that with a sense of citizenship and a sense of broader political community if you're going to sustain a democracy.
Do you not agree that the real threat from identity politics in the United States to Western societies as a whole comes not from the left's supposed obsession with ethnic minorities or transgender rights, but from a president of the United States who has enabled and stoked white nationalism, neo-Nazism?
That's why I wrote the book. I mean, you
well,
know,
that's why I wrote the book, but there's a lot of, it feels like you're trying to bend over backwards to do this kind of, the right's bad, but the left's bad.
No, I'm trying to.
The right is a neo-Nazi right now.
I'm trying to explain, you know, the rise of the right, and I think that there is a kind of tone deafness by, you know, from people on the left to actually what bothers people and what has made a lot of people vote for these populist candidates, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. Some of it is just racism, xenophobia, and so forth. But a lot of it is, you know, driven by other things, that elites really have not paid a lot of attention to a, you know, fairly broad swath of America that constitutes, you know, when you think about the, you know, the 99%, a lot of those people are in there. And I think that if you don't figure out what is bothering them, you're not going to solve the underlying problem that is driving the polarization in the United States.
But I'm asking you, would you accept, is it an equal, is it, it's asymmetric polarization?
Yeah,
do you accept?
It's asymmetric, yeah. So I think the social justice issues are largely, you know, held by the you know, the left-wing groups, but I do think that there's also a
legitimate things on the right, in addition to the racism and bigotry. Just talk about yourself. What about you? How would you define your own identity? You're the grandson of Japanese immigrants to the United States.
Well, you know, whenever I'm asked that, and this was true ever since I was a child, I'd say I'm an American. I mean, I never thought of myself as an Asian American or a Japanese American, and I always thought, you know, part of the reason that it's great to be in America is that I don't have to think that way.
When you see, for example, Asian Americans wanting to assert a group identity, wanting to be better represented in public life or popular culture, you have the recent hit movie, Crazy Rich Asians, which has topped the box office, the first all-Asian cast. That's been celebrated by a great deal of Asian Americans. Is it wrong to celebrate that? Black Americans who look at Black Panther and say, finally, a movie with a black cast, a black director. Isn't that something to celebrate, or is that something you think is dangerous or wrong?
I don't think it's dangerous or wrong. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't particularly celebrate it, but
you don't care that
well, you know,
more people who look like you should be on film.
It represents something. It's not really a movie about America. You know, it's about a lot of rich Chinese in Singapore. You know, I mean, they're connected to America, but you know, it's a phenomenon about the rise of China.
Black Panther is about a fictional country. It's not about the storyline. It's about who you see on screen, the writers, the director, the actors, who you have as role models. You don't think that's important to,
you know, in
this age of identity? No?
I think I've had a pretty interesting, successful life, and it never depended on me seeing a lot of Asian role models out there. I, you know, never thought that that was important in shaping my own career or whatever I did. I thought that...
Do you recognize you're probably quite distinctive and in a minority on that? Most people do want some kind of role models.
Yeah. I mean, and also Asians are different from African Americans, and they're different from, you know, other women, and they're different.
Which is the whole point. Which is why they want to see.
No, but I'm just saying
why everyone wants to get a bit of representation.
Well, yeah, but you know, I just think that representation by itself oftentimes conflicts with other kinds of social values that are important. Like right now, there's this big fight going on in the New York public school system about who gets access to these elite public high schools. And in that case, representation, you know, the representation argument acts directly against the interests of Asian Americans because they're way overrepresented in those schools, because they do better on tests and so forth. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of competing goods here. And if your single focus is on representation, it's, you know, it's going to conflict with some of those other values.
You're most famous for your essay in the phrase, the end of history, what you called, quote, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Do you have any regrets about that line, about that thesis, looking back now?
Well, no. You know, I wrote that in the middle of what's called the third wave of democratization, where the world went from having about 35 democracies to over 100 democracies. So there's a lot of movement in that direction. Over the last 10 years, we've been moving in the opposite direction, not dramatically, but in important ways, the rise of populism, rise of China, and so forth. And so obviously it's a different era. We're not converging like we seemed to be in the 1990s on liberal democracy. But in the long run, how durable that counter trend is, it's really not clear. I think that democracy still has a lot of support around the world, and you see this, constantly showing up in funny places like Armenia or Malaysia.
So you're fundamentally an optimist about the future?
Well, I just think that you need a balanced view. I think that people tend to get carried away by current events, and right now there's, I think, a little bit of excessive pessimism about global democracy, because I think democracy has more going for it than a lot of people would recognize right now.
Francis Fukuyama, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining me on Upfront. That's our show. Upfront will be back next week.